All right, I'm hitting start. All right, our webinar has started and I can see that we've got people coming in. Hi, everybody, and good afternoon or maybe morning, depending on where you are, and happy Friday. Welcome to our webinar presentation, 4 Ways to Plan Impactful Resident Events. My name is Becky McLaughlin. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for WithMe, home of the amenities Sip With Me and Print With Me. We're thrilled to partner with our friends over at Flamingo to bring you this presentation today. I will be turning things over to Jude in just a moment to introduce our wonderful panelists here. But first, I want to go over some housekeeping items. I have opened up the chat, so if you have questions along the way throughout this presentation, feel free to drop your questions in there. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so make sure that you hang on to have all of your questions answered. Also, this presentation is being recorded and we will send copies at the conclusion of the presentation. And then I have a fun slide here to share with everyone. NAA's Apartmentalize is just around the corner in days. The countdown is on. If you are attending, make sure that you stop by and visit WithMe and Flamingo while you're there. And if you're a runner, sign up for our 5K on Thursday morning and conclude the run with the iconic run up the Rocky Steps. All right, I am going to hand this on over to Jude to get things started. Jude?
Perfect. Thank you, Becky. Welcome, everyone. Really excited to have you all join us on this. Hopefully a beautiful Friday where you are. I am in Chicago and it is finally summer. So it's a really big win for us. So I am really excited for today's panel because I am super passionate about like resident events and the ability that it has to really bring residents together, especially in today's day and age where if you read everywhere, you hear that it's right now the loneliest generation that exists. So the ability to really execute great resident events is really something that we need all across. And that's why I am so excited to introduce Brooke and Shellie, who are going to really talk about how to execute very impactful events. So Brooke is the National Events and Engagement Manager for Equity Residential. She has over 15 years of event experience across multiple different event categories. And right now, as the manager of national events and community engagement at Equity Residential, she is really dedicated to fostering connections, creating community, and really helping residents connect on an ongoing basis. So the reason why I wanted Brooke to be on this webinar is because one, she has really amazing experience across various areas. And then two, she is solely responsible for managing multiple events across multiple geographies, across multiple asset types. So she really knows what events to do, where to do them. So she can give a lot of good insight on how to really increase engagement and get your residents to become friends and drive the ultimate thing that we are all looking for, which is retention. And then also really excited to introduce Shellie. So she is the director of lifestyle at Ovation, and they are based out of Vegas. So Shellie serves as the lifestyle director for 28 multifamily communities. So again, she has a wide variety of experience when it comes to resident events. And the reason why I wanted her on the panel is because she can really talk a lot about how to execute high value events for residents and also how to really turn events from what most people think of as a cost center into more of a revenue driver for your communities. So really excited to have both of them on the panel. So I know we didn't plan that, but I'll let Shellie and Brooke just kind of say a quick hi so you guys know that can see their faces as well too if they are not showing up.
Hi, everyone. Excited to talk to you guys about some resident events today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome from fabulous Las Vegas, where it's 110 degrees today.
Ooh, it is hot. Cool. So, for the webinar, our outline is going to be first, we are going to talk about something that I really enjoy, which is the state of resident events. So every year, Flamingo creates a report on how resident events are currently executed. And then we'll go through that. And then next, we will then talk about really how to execute on events. So the first part is we will talk about how to really create, design, and execute on your events. So that one is going to be more of a discussion. Then we will then talk about how to create the perfect event mix. So how do you balance events that have 1,000 people to those like smaller events? So what is the right event mix to really ensure that you engage residents across your whole basis? And then lastly, we will then talk about how to really leverage your amenities to get to drive engagement, activation, and utilization of all of those different amenities and really take advantage of what you have. And then after that, we'll then talk about some of the best practices and words of wisdom from our panelists. And then we will do Q&A. But as Becky mentioned, feel free to ask questions using the chat as we go along. So excited to start on the state of resident events. So every year we do a state of resident events to really understand what are the challenges that property managers face when it comes to events, what are the popular events that they do, what are some of the benefits and impact that they get from resident events. How we are able to do this study is we send out a survey to property managers, and then we also look at data on Flamingo's platform. So Flamingo manages thousands of events every month. So that gives us a really good view on how people do events, the types of events that they do, cost, attendance, and all of that data. So we use that in combination with what we hear from property managers to really create what we consider a great report, and we hope that you agree. So our state of resident events report really covers a few different things, which I am excited to go through. Some of them are surprising, some not so surprising. But what we really hope you take away from this is to really understand how different communities do events, what are some best practices, and what are some great takeaways that you can have. Okay, cool. Becky, next slide. So as part of our state of resident events survey, one of the first questions that we asked our customers, prospects, all of that is, what is the biggest challenge you have when it comes to doing resident events? So by no surprise, I'm sure most of you could have guessed like what are some of those like biggest challenges that you face with doing resident events, whether it's once a month, or whether it's once a week or just a few times for a quarter. But similar to what we saw a year ago and 2 years ago, the biggest challenge at 35% that we saw from property managers is that budget is the single biggest thing that makes it really difficult to do the types of events that you all want to do or that residents get excited about. So budget is really a big thing. And what we have always hoped with our state of resident events is to give you all information that you can present to your clients, to the ownership groups, to really help advocate for why you need more budget for events and some of the things that would help with. So budget was definitely number one. And we saw that both from the qualitative and also the quantitative. Budget, definitely the biggest challenge that people face. The second one was just like time and logistics. So like anything in property management, time is very limited. And events tend to be one of those things that falls off the priority list the fastest. And many of you mentioned that in the surveys that time is really the biggest challenge that you have when it comes to doing and executing events. On the logistics part, what we heard from a lot of people is the logistics are challenging because it takes a long time to, one, try to find the right event people that can help you with events. Try to buy materials if you are doing a food event, trying to do the decorations and all the things that go into really executing on a great event. So time and logistics was something that was also very topical and top of mind. And then the next one that was pretty high on the list was engagement and attendance. So many of you mentioned that you spend that time, you spend that budget to create a really great event. But unfortunately, you run into a challenge where a lot of residents don't show up, or very few residents show up. And it seems like it's almost like a waste for all that time and budget that has been spent. And in addition to the challenges with attendance, many of you also mentioned how difficult it is to try to nail down the right time to do an event, which also leads to some of the challenges that comes out when you think about attendance and then overall engagement. So attendance was definitely one of the ones that was very, very top of mind. And then followed by event ideas. So many of you also mentioned that finding the right events to do is sometimes like challenging. And what happens is you end up doing almost the same event over and over again, which a lot of times is like a breakfast grab and go or something very basic. So coming up with event ideas was one of the um, things that a lot of you found to be a little bit challenging to do on a month-to-month basis. This was especially prevalent for sites that do multiple events per month. So it was very easy for them to run out of ideas very quickly to keep getting people to show up for those events. And then for a few of you, about a 1%, there were no challenges. So congrats to you all for solving the event problem. We'd love to know your secret. For the rest of you, that's why we have the experts here. So Brooke and Shellie are really going to give some tips on how to overcome some of the budget challenges, engagement challenges, and then idea challenges as well too. So really excited to dig a little bit deeper. And then next slide, Becky. The next question that we asked people was, do you think your current budget for events is enough to do the events that your residents like? I was actually very surprised by this one. I thought it would be more skewed towards a no. But for many of you, the budget that you have seems to actually be enough to do resident events. So that combination of time, ideas, and attendance is maybe more of the challenge where budget is a little bit smaller. So this kind of ties into the previous slide. So very surprised that for many of you, it seems like the budget really is close to where you need it to be. And then next slide. And then for this one, I was actually also surprised. I thought this would be more of a mix, but we asked, do you believe events actually drive retention? And for 90% of you, you said absolutely that events do drive retention. Again, I was very surprised by this. I really thought it would be more of a mix where it's like, well, maybe it does, but it seems like it's something that for a lot of you, you have firsthand experience on how events track retention, which is great to hear because that's the whole goal of doing all of these events to build community and then ultimately help residents have a reason to stay longer. So this was definitely one of the ones that was most surprising to me. And then next one. And then the next question that we asked was, do you find that you generate reviews after you do events? So we also had about a mix in the middle where some of you are able to see reviews come through right after you do events. And for some of you, you did not see reviews like come through. So definitely one of the things I would love to learn from the panelists is how for the 45% that maybe did not really see reviews come through, what are some tips to maybe get residents to leave reviews after events? But also great to hear and see that outside of retention, one of the benefits of events is to really drive like online reviews and that growth for that all important like metric. And then next slide. And then the next question that we ask is, do you typically generate pictures from events that you can use on social media? So for a lot of you, you were able to generate pictures from events that you use, which I think for this one was also a surprise for how many people are able to get pictures for events. So this was definitely a surprise for me. So would love to kind of hear from our panelists if this is something that is surprising to them or if it's something that they have also seen as well too. And then next slide. And then one of the most important questions that we asked was, what is your monthly event budget per community? So we sliced and diced this data a couple of ways. So we looked at event budgets for 55 plus active adult, Class A, lease ups, Class B, and then Class C properties as well too. We found that for all the different sites, the average event budget is just over $900, so about 923. What was interesting here is when we did this study about 2 years ago, the average event budget was about 870. So definitely an increase the last couple of years. And then the 55 plus active adults, they came out with the highest budgets overall. So with about 2,500 per month for budgets. And this one all makes sense intuitively because the active adults tend to do a lot more events on a much more frequent basis. So it makes sense that for many of them, the event budgets are much, much higher. And then followed by Class A communities where the average event budget was about 1089 per month. And then right after that were lease ups. So again, makes sense. Lease ups tend to have higher budgets to start with, and then maybe that goes down over time. But we saw that for Class A and lease ups, their budgets are about like the same. And then for Class B, we found that the average event budget was about 789 per month or 788 per month. And then for Class C communities, the event budgets were close to 600. This one was the most surprising for me because when we did the same survey about 2 years ago, for Class C assets, the average event budget was just around 300. So it looks like they have made the largest jump since the last time that we did this study. So kudos to some of the older assets for finding a way to get more budget for their events and having a way to build community on a more regular basis as well too. So this was definitely the biggest like surprise for me for how much that almost like a 50% like jump. Cool. And then next one, Becky. And then we looked at a couple of things. So we looked at how much people actually spend on events on a month-to-month basis, along with other areas of engagement, which are primarily like fitness classes. So across the board, we found that the average event is just over $1,000. And keep in mind that this is the average. So there are a lot of events that are way less than that, and a lot of events that are much higher than that. But the average came out to be just about 1,100. And this included every type of event from a simple breakfast grab and go to some sites that did their grand opening event. So this data came from a mix of the survey that we sent out and also looking at the events on Flamingo's platform where we are able to look at about 3,000 event bookings from the last couple of months. So I was also surprised by this because the last time that we did this survey, the average event budget was just, or the average event cost was just around $700. So it's quite a big jump from just like 2 years ago. And then the next one was the average cost of fitness classes. So many of you that do fitness classes, you were able to also provide more information about how much you spend on fitness classes as a whole and then individually. So we found that the average cost of a fitness class was just about $111. And then for many of you, you do anywhere from 2 to 4 fitness classes per week. And the full cost of your fitness program, so that whole monthly cost, was just about $1,000. So many of you, what we found is that about a quarter of sites have some type of regular fitness programming. So that was also a surprise to me because the last time that we did the survey, the representation for fitness classes was much, much smaller. So it looks like more sites are using fitness classes in order to activate the fitness center. So this was a very interesting trend to see how that has changed. And next slide. So the next thing that we looked at were the most popular events that people were doing. By no surprise, happy hours were the most popular. A couple of years ago, what we found is that breakfast grab and goes were the most popular, but it's kind of switched now where happy hours have become a lot more popular. I think part of the reason is because they're a little bit easier to execute, and they are still a very, very fun and engaging way to bring your residents down. So we found that happy hours were really popular. The next one that we found to be the second most popular was actually pool parties. So part of the reason for that large representation for pool parties is because for a lot of sites, they might do 1 or 2 events per year. So a holiday party or their summer party. So for many of the sites that don't do as many events, the pool party was like the main event that they did. So we found like a large representation of sites doing pool parties. The next really popular one were outdoor movie events. So another really popular event that we saw pop up a lot was outdoor movie events. What I like about outdoor movie events, and I think why a lot of sites do that, is because it's a simple event to put together, and it's one that is family friendly and one that you can use to engage a lot of people. All you need is a lawn, so you can activate your entire community. So that one was surprising, but also not surprising. And then next for popular were food truck events. So we found and saw a lot of sites that do a regular food truck event. So they have like a set schedule with a food truck company. So they come like every month. Sometimes we saw some come every week to execute a food truck. So that one was also really interesting for how some sites are doing it. So if you can find a food truck, you can have them come on site on a monthly basis. What we found for that as well too is for some of the sites, they paid for part of the meal for residents, and then for other sites, the residents paid for the meals themselves. So all the event executor did was just find a food truck and then arrange a time and then marketed that event to residents, and residents were able to pay for the food themselves. So if you're low on budget, that might be a great type of event to try to do. And then the other ones that we saw were other events that were very food heavy as well. So everything from like breakfast, brunch, and mimosas to sushi making classes to pie tastings. So a variety that are a little bit on the smaller side. So these were some of the really popular events. And again, the happy hours seem to be the most popular, partly because they are so easy to do and execute. And then the next thing that we looked at were what are like the impacts of events. So next slide. So we looked at how events actually impact a few different metrics that I'm sure you all care about. So we looked at how do events actually impact online reviews. So from the self-reported attribution that some people mentioned, it seems like they saw a pretty good uptick in events when, or a pretty good uptick in reviews when they did an event. So we looked at the actual data, comparing event budgets to online reviews. And what we found is that buildings with the top 10 highest review scores allocate on average about 1,100 per month for events. And then for buildings with the top 10 lowest online reviews, allocate only about 700 per month for events. So basically, for the sites with the largest budgets, they also had the highest number of reviews, whereas the sites with the lowest budgets also had the lower number of reviews and review scores. So this really confirmed some of that initial data that was reported, where some of you mentioned that when you do events, you do see an uptick in online reviews. So this definitely confirmed that. So we looked at the actual data on here. So if you're looking to boost the online reviews, don't forget to do some events. And then next slide. So we dug even deeper to look at not just online reviews, but actual resident satisfaction. So how does resident satisfaction compare to event allocation, event execution, and a few other things? So we read through online, or not online, we read through internal reviews or internal surveys completed by residents. And we found a really interesting trend where on the positive side, in 89% of cases where a resident mentioned the presence of events. So if in their satisfaction report, they organically mentioned events. In 89% of the time, that was a happy mention. So they were like, oh, I'm happy because of events or something else. So whenever events were mentioned or the presence of events was mentioned, that resident tended to be much happier. And then we also found the opposite, where in 87% of cases where a resident mentioned the lack of events. So when a resident completed like a resident survey, and part of the survey said, oh, there are no events within the community. In most situations, that resident was either neutral, unhappy, or very unhappy. So a very strong correlation between resident satisfaction and their overall resident satisfaction and the number or the quality of events done at that community. So this one was surprising by or what was most surprising here for me was how frequently resident surveys actually mention resident events. So I was very, very surprised by this. Next one. I think, was that the last one? Oh, this is the last one. So we dug a little bit deeper as well to look at renewal intent. So renewal intent is pre-renewal surveys where residents tell you whether or not they are likely or unlikely to renew. And in the same thing, in 62% of cases where a resident mentioned the presence of events, they rated their likeliness to renew as yes or probably. Meaning that for 62% of residents, if they mentioned events, they were pretty likely to renew, or at least their intention to renew was pretty high. And then the other side too, and this was very surprising, was that in 100% of cases where a resident organically mentioned that, hey, there are no events here, their likeliness to renew, their self-reported likeliness to renew was a no or probably not. So I would say very insightful to how residents actually themselves like view events. So when they are like, oh, there are no events here, for most of the time, they are very, very unlikely to renew based on that self-report. So this data kind of condensed with what some of you reported in the open survey as we compared it to what is within this survey. So really curious to get some feedback from Shellie and from Brooke about some of this data. I think the first one for me is really looking at the impact of events. So Becky, if you can go to the first slide where we saw that for most people, they said that in 89 or 90% so of cases, they saw that events were that that events lead to renewal. So I think it's this one. So Shellie, I'm curious to know for you, have you found that when you all do events or as you've done more events, have you seen an impact on retention, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. The properties that we do the events at definitely have a better retention rate. And we actually just discovered last week one of the properties that we monetize with the event program had our highest least percentage in the portfolio as of last week or for last week. So putting some numbers to what we're doing is actually pretty cool.
It's really interesting. So, to add on to that, or to get a little bit more insight, do you know what the percentage difference is between the sites that do events versus the ones that do not? Like, what is that delta in retention, if you have that info?
I don't have that info, but we can definitely crunch the numbers.
Mhm. Very cool. But for me, this was a very interesting time because again, I expected this to be kind of a split where some people will say, yeah, I think events drive retention, and other people are saying that, yeah, I don't think events really like drive retention. And then I'm curious for Brooke, what have you found? Do you all have you seen like something similar, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna agree with you, Jude, that I would have expected this to be maybe more split.
Hmm.
I do think it's a bit challenging for us to directly correlate retention
Hmm.
sometimes, but I think we do get a lot of candid feedback from residents, which, show that they really appreciate the sense of community and they really appreciate the events and all of the effort that's input by the property teams. So I think that definitely has an impact on their decision to stay.
Yeah, yeah, no, agreed. And then we'll love to also get some feedback from you all on the difficulties or challenges that property managers face with events. So Becky, can you go to that slide? So looking at this, I'm curious to know if this kind of aligns with some of what you all have faced, or if not at all, or if some of these you feel you struggle with the most. So, Brooke, would love to get your feedback on some of the challenges that you have faced and how this kind of aligns with how you see it.
Yeah, I think it's pretty on par with, some of the challenges that we've heard from our on-site teams. Um, Attendance is interesting because I think that the way that our strategy is with programming, we are hosting events at communities where we do see a lot of engagement and residents are usually really eager to attend events and come. And I also think it kind of ties back to the promotional piece too. Sending a save the date, sending an email reminder, sending, hanging flyers around the building and putting it on your portal or, social media posts. So I think promotion of the event is really important. And if the timeline of the promotion as well will drive more people to attend the event.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of these, for you, which one, or if it's not represented here, what have you found to be your biggest challenge when it comes to events, and how have you kind of addressed that?
Yeah, yeah. I do think budget is obviously the number one most
Mhm.
challenging factor, but I think there are ways to kind of combat that. So, if you have a budget for the year and you're only allocated $600 a month for an event, perhaps maybe rethink the strategy and host something once per quarter so you have a little bit more dollar amount to work with to execute a more elevated event rather than trying to struggle and put together, an event that might not be as impactful as
Mhm.
$600 and kind of maybe rethink how the money is allocated and how you can kind of shift it and work it in that way.
Yeah, no, definitely agree that in situations like these, quality might trump like quantity every single time.
Of course. Yep.
Yeah. And then I'm curious, Shellie, with so many people facing the budget challenge, you all have a really more of like a unique model for your events. So I'm curious to hear more about how you do or how you all um, have kind of achieved, I would say, a pretty high and impactful way to do events that I think you've almost like monetized in a way. So curious to learn like how you've overcome some of these challenges, and then if you do face any challenges at all when it comes to events.
Yes, we have at Ovation, we have monetized the events by implementing a lifestyle fee at roughly 6 properties. So not every property has this mandatory fee. And in your market, it might look something like an amenity fee, or I even see a technology fee. I also see lifestyle fees in the market that have nothing to do with events, and it's more about, smart home capability. But for Ovation, the lifestyle program was created to develop a sense of community. And while it is a mandatory monthly fee, that then feeds my budget so I'm able to curate and execute a very wide range of events that target everybody's likes and needs. So that's actually why I was brought on, was to create this department and create this community for our residents. I would say that outside of budget, since that's not technically a constraint for me personally in my company, time and logistics is, I would say, Ovation's number one, mostly because, your property managers are already working 8+ hours a day. They already have a lot on their plate, and it's not really in their area of expertise to execute an elevated on-brand event. So I would say time and logistics sticks out for me, but we do not have the property staff execute these events because it is outside of their work hours. So we don't want to have to require anybody to stay later or anything like that.
Yeah. And it's a couple of points that I found really interesting. Like one is that on here we have budget as the most common challenge, and for you all, you kind of turned that into like the opposite, where budget is just like not a constraint at all. So you've kind of found a way to
Yeah.
speak the asset managers like language.
And it's not even like a big money maker for the company. It is actually a drop in the bucket compared to rent income. So we have figured out how to monetize it and keep everyone happy and put it back in the residents' even or wheelhouse.
Mhm. You mentioned that for how you all have it set up, it's a mandatory fee that residents have to participate in. Do you all
Mhm.
get any pushback where residents are like, well, I don't attend events. Like, why are you making me pay this? Oh, not at all.
Yes, absolutely. There's always that one resident, right, that doesn't like what you're doing or, claims that they're never there during the event. So, what I do is I just make sure the events are all different days and times so it can accommodate others. But however, when we first rolled out the program at existing stabilized assets, there was a little bit of pushback. But overall, after the years have gone by, the new tenants that come in replace the ones that might have not been happy just in general, or moving out of state or whatever.
Oh, very interesting. So I think that's a great takeaway for a lot of people that kind of face the same constraints with budgets, to figure out like how can you turn this thing into something that's actually a revenue generator for your company. And I think that's where you can have like the most impact. If I can give like one takeaway, I know we're still going through this, but if I can give like one takeaway, would definitely be get creative with how you can turn this little thing into like an actual revenue generator for your company. Cool. So I think next is to really learn from the team like how you can go about actually executing events at a very like high level. So kind of talk about like the impact, budgets, and all of that. So how do we actually go about designing and executing events that residents like fall in love with, where attendance doesn't become an issue? So that's kind of the goal here. So where I want to start is with Shellie. So at a very like high level, you run events across a portfolio. So I'm sure you have like some type of checklist to ensure that every event is successful. I know when we had some of our initial discussions, you mentioned that you've really gotten to train a lot of your vendors and other people to really do events at that like brand standard that you want. So love to kind of learn a little bit more how you actually do that, if you have a checklist and all the tips and best practices that you have.
Yes, absolutely. So what I like to do first is look at past metrics of events. I keep track of how many people come to each event. Um, then I make sure that those types of events are continually on the calendar as like the staples, if you will. I also implement resident feedback into these events. So after we do the resident surveys on events, somebody might say, we really need a fitness class that's not outside on the lawn and over on this side. So I take that resident feedback and I make sure that I implement it into the next few months or the next calendars, not necessarily next month. And also training my vendors or the vendors that Ovation uses. We have a very elevated presentation that we like to display. It matches the backdrop of our amenities. So we make sure that every vendor is trained properly. Everybody, of course, has all their food handling cards, and people know how to respond to residents in a positive way. If they have questions that maybe the vendor are able to answer, they are then able to feed it back to the property so that it can get the residents' questions answered. So those are like the main things that I do when I'm checklisting and making the events for the next month.
Okay. And then how for the vendors that you mentioned, like how prescriptive do you go? Do you have like a playbook that you give to them, or is it more like a training video, or is it more like a conversation to say, hey, here are our like standards?
It's more of like a mentoring process of, what we expect. I do send out, a bulletin every once in a while, like, hey, only these kinds of paper plates can be used, for example, no solo cups. We haven't had that before, but that would be something that I would say to them and give a list of things that I prefer that they purchase, different types of cups, napkins, etc.,
Mhm.
so that everything can look good.
Wow. And then how does that like backdrop kind of come into play? Is the purpose there to kind of set the atmosphere? Is it more for like pictures, or how does that kind of play into your event like strategy?
All of the above. So we want to definitely create a picturesque backdrop against our beautiful luxury properties. That's definitely all included in this strategy.
I love that because all of that helps kind of drive attendance because when you take those really nice looking pictures, you post them on social media or internally, residents like see that might have missed out on the event and they're like, oh wow, I really should have gone to that great event.
Exactly.
So I love that process. And then for Brooke, like for you, how do you kind of gauge resident satisfaction and ROI for like events? So you are running events across a wide like portfolio. And for that role to be in place, there have to be a reason why. So I'm kind of curious like how you gauge resident satisfaction and ROI for each like event.
Yeah, that's a great question. We use RSVP lists to gauge the overall interest when we first send out the communication. And again, that doesn't always correlate with the attendees that actually show up.
Mhm.
But after the event, post-event surveys are sent out, and we have a very specific rating scale. So there's a list of questions. There's open-ended questions that we use where residents can type in their candid feedback on what types of events they'd like to see, what they liked best about the event, what they didn't like. So we kind of, to Shelley's point, just gather all of that information, and that helps us kind of review the satisfaction. It helps us inform us about future programming and things like that. So after we collect all that feedback from the events that we host in each market from those responses, if we see a 90% in the ratings of very good or good, we consider that a successful event. And then also the attendance and just candid feedback from our on-site teams who we actually prefer them to be on-site because they are the ones that have the direct relationship with the residents. So they are really the ones that are hosting the event, connecting with residents, forming those connections, and really like building that sense of community with their residents because they know them best. So we take their candid feedback, and also we do get feedback from the vendors that we use on site as well.
Got it. And looking at that, like 90% where you say this is a successful event because residents like all give like a really high score. Do you then use some of that data to inform the next event that you do? So if you see that, oh, residents really rated this type of event highly, do you then incorporate that into the next set of events that you do?
Yeah, yeah. And usually we see if, a resident is rating the event low
Mhm.
for some reason, they usually will type a reason why. So we're able to see exactly what they were unhappy with. So moving forward, we can work with our vendors to say, hey, like XYZ, just so you know, for next event, let's fix this. Let's, kind of troubleshoot and problem solve what the issue was for which caused the reason for a low rating.
Mhm. And then similar question to what I asked like Shellie, for you, what kind of falls on your checklist of must-dos for each event before everything's like done?
Yeah, I think yeah, we use, a lot of third-party event
Mhm.
services like Flamingo and it's different in each market. So really just making sure that we have a really good working relationship with those vendors and, you know, kind of just letting them know what our expectations are and our brand standards. And I think we have a really good book of business with different vendors in every market. So just making sure that those vendors are being vetted, they fit within our budgets, they're executing on brand and on point. Um, to all the points that Shellie made, I think it's really about, you know, working with companies and vendors that are really on brand for your company and for
Um,
your community.
And then have you found that residents are resonate towards like a certain type of event that you do like on a regular basis? Or ask another way, like what are some of the best events that you've done that you kind of always like fall back on?
Yeah, we have put together kind of guidance and a menu of events that we kind of choose from. So obviously really popular events, going back to your data, I wasn't surprised about, outdoor movie nights,
Mhm.
um, pool parties, live music events are really great for us. I think too, also that we've been seeing a trend in is more experiential events. So hosting workshops and classes that are more creative and kind of educational, like candle making workshops, floral arranging classes, and things like that kind of creates more of like a niche group of people that have similar interests. So it might not be the largest event in the world, but you have 25 people who have very similar interests and they're really getting to know each other, and that's kind of what sparks that connection and friendship.
Mhm. Yeah, and I love that. And I think that kind of plays into how you kind of think about like your event mix. So, Shelley, I'm kind of curious for you, looking at events across like six sites. How do you think about the right event mix for specific communities, or how do you think about the right mix just as an overall?
Yeah, it's important to gauge people's interest in their different types of interest and kind of cater to those, like Brooke was speaking to with like the niche markets. But also, I find that each property is different in what they like to do. One property doesn't like to do happy hour because there's a bunch, primarily sober residents. Some properties like to party per se. So it's kind of up to the individual properties. They kind of dictate my event mix for each calendar month.
Got it. And then question for you, Brooke. If just playing off of what Shelley said, so if you were a brand new event person or you're a leasing agent and someone is like, oh well, Brooke, you are now in charge of events. How do you go about thinking what the right event mix is? Like you've never done events before, you don't know what the residents are going to like. How do you kind of break down that ideal like event mix like for the next like 12 months?
Yeah, I think it's, really taking the time to get to know your resident base. So if, to Shelley's point, is very prescriptive based on the community that you're planning events for. So I think it's just a matter of, getting to know your resident demographic really well. Is it a lot of kids? Is it a lot of families? Is it young professionals, roommates? Kind of have conversations with them and get to know what their likes and interests are. And then, um, you know, it's okay if you host an event and you don't get a large turnout. Maybe now you know that event type doesn't work well there. So, you know, trying things out is, I think, really beneficial because you can, you know, select what works really well. But yeah, I think it's just getting to know your resident demographic because, like Shellie said, it's going to be different at every community, and not every
Mhm.
community is going to maybe want to have, you know, alcohol, or maybe they do, or maybe, you know,
Yeah.
or maybe they're not really interested in floral arranging workshops and they're not that into creative events. Or so you just kind of have to, you know, it's okay to host something
Mhm.
that might not get a lot of traction at first, um, but soon you will know if you're just starting out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Brooke, you kind of mentioned some really cool events, everything from like candle making. I've seen some trends where the really popular ones that residents, it's more like experiential, and residents are really able to learn something new. So I'm curious for you, Shellie, what are some of the popular events that you have done that you've kind of like just see residents like sign up really quickly or who get like really excited about? So what are your like
Yes,
your recommended events?
the experiential ones lately. A sun tea class did really, really well last month. So residents could blend their own tea with organic herbs of their choice. And then they were taught how to sit it out on their balcony and brew the tea the next day so that they have their own sun tea. And then they can start buying their own herbs and, you know, even growing their own herbs. It even inspired someone to do. So that was definitely popular last month. This next coming month, we have a succulent terrarium, excuse me, workshop on the calendar. And also a paint and sip has been heavily requested. So working with a local paint and sip company to come out this month.
No, I love that. I love, especially love like the Santi. That's such like a unique experience that I don't think a lot of people would really like think of or do. And I think when I think about like a really great event mix, for me in my mind, it's always you do like the popular events that everyone likes, like a happy hour, sip and paint, and they kind of
Yeah.
sprinkle in the experiential and learnings that residents otherwise would really never do themselves, because I don't think for many of your residents, they are ever going to think about like a Santi workshop or something. But presenting that to them is going to be like, oh wow, that's very different than something I've really ever thought about.
Yeah, being creative in this process is definitely a major part of the strategy is to create differentiating events that might not appeal to everyone and to the smaller niche group. But there's multiple niche groups, so it
Yeah.
all balances out.
Yeah. And then one question from Kristen is, have you found like a certain day or time to have the most successful turnout? So Brooke, I'm gonna guess since you run um events across a pretty wide portfolio, I'm gonna guess that you have like set times that you're like, oh, this is when we always do events. I'm curious what days and times you've kind of set aside.
Yeah, we usually see, we will usually host our events on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, um,
Mhm.
with the exception of some Saturday events that will maybe do like a daytime pool event.
Mhm.
But if we are doing a morning breakfast event, we'll probably start around 8, which is mostly when people are leaving for work. So around 8 to 10 to also get those people that work from home. And then also our afternoon events are probably like around 6 to 8 p.m. Again, depending on like, you know, summer months, winter months with
Mhm.
the sun going down, and especially on the West Coast, like sometimes we'll have outdoor events, but it gets darker early, so we have to just like adjust the time. But I would say a weekday evening would be best, and then on Saturdays, we'll usually host from like, you know, 11 to 1 or 12 to 2, and we usually do 2-hour events.
Wow. Then, Shelly, I'm curious for you as well. What are like the best times you've found or best days to do events? Is it kind of similar where it's that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or what have you found to be the most successful days and times?
So here in the Las Vegas market, our most popular times are Wednesday and Thursday evenings, 6:30 and after, so we can cater to the bankers hour crowds. And then also weekends. So the weekend lunch hour is actually my busiest time, and that's where we can attract the most attendees.
Mm. That makes sense. Everyone's home. It's the weekend. They don't really have like a lot of other plans because they might have things in the evening.
Exactly. And I do have a couple of properties that are more nightlife properties, you know, because Las Vegas is built on hospitality. So these later times in the evening, in the lunch hour during the weekends works for them so that they can catch an event, catch a meal before they go off to work.
Mhm. That makes sense. And then, Brooke, I'm curious, oh, and Shellie as well, too. One of the questions is, what is the best way to combat having a smaller budget, but wanting to do really experiential events? So how do you do great events at a smaller budget?
Yeah, this is interesting. Great question. We will have sometimes if, say, for example, we're hosting a sip and paint, we only have a certain dollar amount allocated to that event. We'll cap the event at a certain amount of people. So say it's 25 guests, and then we provide a wait list. So if people cancel, they can join. Also, another thing that we find is partial payment. So we'll have the resident pay a portion of the event, say at a discounted rate of $10, and then we'll kind of underwrite the costs and then guarantee that cost to the vendor. So it's a really great way to kind of, work with a bit of a smaller budget. And also, we find that if residents are paying to attend an event, they are most likely going to attend because sometimes we see them drop off. Like if somebody RSVPs and they have no skin in the game, they didn't pay for it, so they
Mhm.
don't show up. So this kind of combats that as well.
So interesting. So it sounds like you almost do something kind of similar to, but in a different way to what the Ovation team with Shellie do. You do charge
Mhm.
residents for events.
Yeah, but the residents are paying the vendors directly, so we're not
Mhm.
making income on that.
Got it. Got it. And then I'm next curious on just amenities and how you can kind of bring that into events. So Becky, curious for I know with you all, you have a really good perspective on amenities and bringing residents like down to whether it's to grab a cup of coffee. So I kind of let you run with this one.
Sure, thanks, Jude. And we're coming up close to the end of the webinar here, so I'm thrilled to talk about amenities, passionate about amenities over here at WithMe. And, I love the creative ideas that I heard you both share. We have some very creative clients where the coffee amenity lends itself to holiday parties with cocoa tastings. And we also have clients coming to us to help facilitate coloring parties where they're using the printer and they're printing
Oh,
coloring
wow.
pages. And we've actually seen so much interest that we began building playbooks and digital marketing templates to draw awareness to these events and elevator flyers. So, Brooke and Shellie, I'd love to hear from you about maybe some ways that you've gotten creative to either activate amenities or leverage amenities for your events. And Shellie, if you'd like to start.
Yes, a great example is one of our newest property has an enclosed courtyard. And this courtyard is like the amenity haven. It has a fitness lawn, it has fire pits, it has a dog park for yappy hour. It has so many different components that we can activate simultaneously 10 different events if we really wanted to. So that's one way that we are elevating our amenity spaces.
Nice. And Brooke, any examples that you'd like to share?
I think our summer months are our busiest season, so that's when we are really utilizing our outdoor spaces, which are obviously the most beautiful spaces. We have really nice resident lounges too in certain markets, but I think people just, there's an elevated level of happiness when you're outdoors, and so really trying to utilize those really nice rooftop spaces, sun decks, pools, great lawns, things like that. So yeah.
Great. And we are at time here, so I figured we could go around the horn and give any final thoughts, words of wisdoms from our expert panels. And Brooke, while you're off of mute, if you'd like to start with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for events to fall by the wayside,
Mhm.
with 1,000 million things going on all the time. But I just really think it's important to stress the role that events play in really creating that sense of community. And I think it really, really helps. So yeah.
Great.
And for me, I think that events really drive resident satisfaction. Residents are just overall more happy when you're creating a nice community for them, and they're just nicer in their everyday dealings with the property staff and more apt to renew. And for me, it creates a differentiator between me and my competition.
Great. And how about Jude? Any closing thoughts and words of wisdom from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about events, I think events are just one part of engagement, like an overall like engagement strategy. So if you think about your events as a way to bring residents together, there are multiple ways to do that. So we recommend digital engagement. So do a fun trivia with your residents virtually. Do a pet of the month contest. Find local events around the city and find a way to get residents to go together. So events or to drive community, it doesn't always mean just do in-person resident events and spend money on resident events. There are lots of ways to get residents to come together without having to spend money or time. Just you can be the facilitator right in the middle.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming together, our panelists and the attendees, the participants who are still hanging on here. What a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we did record this and we will be sending it out to everyone who attended and registered for the presentation. If there are any hanging questions for these experts, feel free to respond to the email communications that will be coming from both with me and Flamingo, and we'll make sure that we get the questions to Brooke and Shellie and get you answers. Thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to the next time. Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.